tonight we've got a special event for you. We're going to hear from some of the people who've worked on the major restoration project, which is currently underway. Let's now meet the first of our guests, Lewis Proudfoot, Managing Director of Cliveden Conservation. So good evening, Lewis.
Good evening, David. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Now, I understand that the company was started by your father, Trevor Proudfoot, a stonemason who conserved and restored historic buildings using techniques that were true to their origins. After initially working as an advisor to the National Trust for 8 years from 1982, he set up the new company in December 1990, but still continued his association with the National Trust. And I believe you celebrated your 30th anniversary at the end of last year. So can you just tell us why the company is called Cliveden Conservation?
Sure. Well, because we're based here on the Cliveden estate, Dad was asked by the National Trust to set up a workshop for the conservation of their statuary collections back in the 80s. They offered us some workshops here, and we've been here ever since.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much. And I believe you also have workshops in Norfolk and in Somerset.
We do, yeah.
As well. And like your father, I believe, Lewis, who you described as a Goliath of that, well, you started training as a stonemason before putting down the tools to run the company and tackle the fascinating day-to-day conservation challenges that your company is presented with. So can you now talk us through the three main areas of your company's work? I think you have an example to illustrate each of these, but if we start with the multi-award winning conservation of the Wimpole Tower in Cambridge.
Sure. We divide the business into three sections, three areas. So we've got stone, plaster, the decorative arts, and we do an advisory and consultancy element that crosses all those disciplines. The building on your screen is one we're really proud of. It's the Wimpole Tower. And we use it here to represent the scope of works we do within the stone section. So you can see indent repairs, carved stonework, new roof, as well as a lot of mortar repairs, so repointing, consolidation, shelter coats and things like that. It was always meant to appear as a ruin, this building, so we did a lot of consolidation whilst making that tower weatherproof for the next generations to appreciate.
That's fantastic. And from Cambridge, let's travel to London now and the Church of St Mary Magdalene in Paddington.
Yeah, this is a great project. We did a whole load of conservation to various decorative surfaces. So the image there is the ceiling above the nave on this church, Victorian church built by G.E. Street. It's painted wood, painted timber with mariflage portraits of all the saints. So that's canvas paintings that are stuck to the timber. Previously, it had been varnished and the varnish dulled over time. So all that detail was obscured. So we removed all the varnish and cleaned that ceiling, which is well lit up by the new lighting scheme, which was one of the other elements of that project. But as well as doing all that kind of cleaning and redecoration to various materials, the decorative art section also undertake the conservation of sculpture and mosaics, architectural materials such as code stone and terracotta, a whole range of conservation of objects as well.
That's great. Thanks. Thank you. And finally, let's go to Surrey and to the Temple of Bacchus in the 18th century landscape garden in Paynes Hill Park, where 5 years ago, I think Cliveden Conservation won an award for the conservation of the Crystal Grotto there.
Yeah, and this building follows on from that grotto project. This is essentially a new build. There was nothing there before, but it recreated a temple that was in the park some years ago, lost in the 20s, I think it was. And we use it to represent all the elements of plasterwork that we do. So there's lime render there, we recast columns, all the decoration, the cornice, as well as hand modelling the frieze on the tympanum, which shows a scene of Bacchus, because it's a temple of Bacchus. So we do a lot of lime plaster work internally and externally, as well as decorative plaster. And at the moment, we're actually building a 3-metre tall decorative fibrous dome for another project, which we're casting at the moment in our Bath workshop.
Thanks very much. And I understand that this month you won an award for another work in plaster in Chichester, I believe, where you restored an old ceiling there. Well, but this evening we're going to be looking at the work you did on the Elizabeth Tower. And before we go on to discuss that work in detail, can you just explain, Lewis, why you think that this project, this Elizabeth Tower restoration project, was such a good fit with the values of Cliveden Conservation?
Yeah, well, the last couple of years we spent a bit of time thinking about what drives us as an organisation, and when we distilled all our thoughts, it came down to this idea of best practice, and we split that into three areas. Best practice for the buildings and objects that we work on, best practice for the people we work with, and then at a kind of higher level, best practice for our nation's heritage. And Big Ben obviously ticks all those boxes. We're able to deliver a really sensitive job that was based on research, careful research, and as you'll see as we go through this presentation, it was delivered at a really high standard of quality. We put a lot of importance on training and developing our people as well as other people we work with, so it's wonderful to be able to sharing this kind of best practice with everybody who's watching and sharing our experiences of this work. And then that third value is the kind of lofty overarching value that you often hear about when people talk about their values, but in this case I think it's relevant. You can't get more iconic than Big Ben, and we're lucky enough to work on some of the nation's most loved buildings, and hopefully we aim to influence the approaches to conservation at this level in the right way to ensure that our heritage, everybody's heritage, can be enjoyed by everybody and generations to come. So it's really great to be involved in such a collaborative project on such an important building.
Thank you very much indeed. And now let's move on to talk about the work you carried out for the nation on the tower. And I would now like to introduce our next guests, and in a moment you'll be able to see two of the guests who are also going to be talking about the detailed work, Alexandra Miller and Lukas Konatski. And before we go on to meet or to see both of them, I'd like to start with Alexandra Miller, because Alexandra has a background in fine art, and she started a decorating company where she fell in love with the old buildings she was decorating, particularly the Georgian terraces in Bloomsbury. And from there, it was a natural step into conservation. And after studying the restoration and conservation of decorative surfaces and working on a major project at the library of Kenwood House, which is Robert Adams' 18th century masterpiece, she joined Cliveden Conservation in 2016 and now manages the London-based decoration projects. So, after that long introduction, good evening, Alex. And can you tell us about the work which has been carried out by Cliveden Conservation on the Elizabeth Tower?
So we were involved with this project with the historical paint analysis and the reinstatement of the decorative schemes. There were two parts to this project.
Do you just want to say a word, Lewis, about the scope of the work you carried out on the Elizabeth Tower, and then hopefully Alex will be joining us again in a moment.
So we undertook initially some paint analysis to understand the various schemes of work that had gone on the tower over the various years. Once we had done those reports and understood the scheme that we were going to apply, we undertook full removal of all the paint from the clock faces and all the stone around it. Once removed, we redecorated and finally regilded all the various areas of decoration.
Fantastic. So, Alex, what I would like to do is move on to the next image on the PowerPoint, and I'd like you to tell us about the clock faces first of all. There's lots else to talk about, but can you just remind us how they looked when you first arrived on site?
Yes, so I was quite keen to include this image as a reminder of what we were presented with before the project began. So this is the iconic black and gold scheme. What this is that it's the most up-to-date, before the project started, application of a paint layer that had been applied over the paint layer before, which was what happened historically for the last 160 years. Each decorative scheme had been applied over the last. That basically created a very thick paint layer, which had its benefits. It was so thick that it perfectly preserved the underlying stone and the carvings, and they were in pristine condition when we removed all the paint. And also, because all of the paint, all of the decorative schemes were present, it enables a thorough analysis to be carried out. The downside of it was, as you'll see later in the presentation, we were tasked with removing this paint, which was no mean feat.
Okay, and I think you'll be coming on to talk about that in just a moment. But really, this project began with detective work, didn't it? Because you had to try and find out exactly what had been there before. So if you could tell us about the first phase in the project, when you had to record everything that you found and then you continued your research from there.
Sure. So this image here details one of our marked up drawings. It was basically, we had to produce a robust labelling and documentation to catalogue where we'd taken paint chips from. Now, these paint chips were taken by us and sent up to our collaborators, Lincoln Conservation, based at Lincoln University. There were so many samples taken that we needed to carefully annotate the exact location, so it would give them the opportunity to be able to understand where these paint chips had originated from.
And I think in the next slide we can see that, can't we? We can see where those paint chips have been taken from.
Yeah, this is a close-up of the bottom right-hand corner of, I think, the west clock face. Just an example to show how many paint chips were taken.
Indeed. So as well as taking the paint chips to be examined under a microscope at Lincoln University, you also tried to match the colours you discovered by carefully scraping away the black paint. I think the next slide shows that, doesn't it?
Yes, so sometimes it's not possible to take paint chips from site if the substrate's too hard, for example. And here that was exactly what happened. It was the metal numerals on the clock face. Not only was the substrate too hard, but the paint was too brittle to get any kind of meaningful analysis. So we needed to go back to basics and manually scrape back the paint layers. Here we've got Andrea Walker, one of our senior conservators on site, managed to beautifully open up a exploratory window and found the now famous Prussian blue. We were able, it was such a beautiful sample that was revealed that we were able to get quite a faithful match.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And as you say, that Prussian blue now is what people are going to see on the clock face. But I think actually we recognise that picture, don't we, from when we've been doing decorating at home, and you sometimes get a surprise when you take the top layers of paint off. But once you had carried out the investigation and the research, it was time to remove the layers of paint from the stone, as you were saying earlier. Now, I understand this was a difficult and laborious process, and you had to use some modern materials to help remove the paint, as well as a great deal of hard work. So if you could just tell us about that.
So yeah, this is an image of an almost completely stripped clock face. The Charles Barry scheme that was discovered, if you like, or rediscovered through the analysis was inclusive of a large quantity of stripped stone. And to faithfully recreate the scheme, it had to appear like it had never been painted. The paint was so thick, as I mentioned before, that it really was no mean feat getting this paint off. We devised a method through a lot of trialling of removing the paint without using anything caustic or abrasive, which was the application of a proprietary paint stripper put directly onto the paint that softened the paint, and what was revealed was a kaleidoscope of colours underneath, which was also mentioned in the Lincoln Conservation report. once the paint had been removed back to relatively sound substrate, we utilised gentle steam and manual scrubbing. But I want to stress that the system of removing the paint was repeated several times. There was so much paint.
Yeah, and I think what we're seeing there is pieces of waxed paper, isn't it, that were keeping the I think you described it to me as a poultice that was underneath there, which was the gradually dissolving paint, and you had to remove the wax paper before it got to dry. And I think in the next photograph we can see one of your colleagues at work with some very fine tools.
Yeah, this is Ellie Daniel, who's one of our gilders, and this image has two, I wanted to show it for two reasons. It shows the tiny tools that we had to use and to get all of the paint off the tiny nooks and crannies. And there were many. It was there was high relief. The carvings were quite high relief, so to remove all of the paint out of it without damaging the stone substrate was quite difficult, but we achieved it. And the other part of this photo is to show that the breadth of skills that the team brought with them were utilised, but also everybody mucked in when they had to, and did, as you can see, very not the most desirable job of paint stripping the stone clock faces.
But nevertheless, an essential part, not just to reveal the stone, but also to create a solid base for what was coming next. Because I think it's true, isn't it, that in order to get beautifully gilded surfaces, you need the clean stone and then the application of the priming layers to be done carefully as well. So thank you very much, Alex.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to say about that we had to not only remove the volume of paint that we had to, but we afford to cause any damage to the underlying stone substrate for not only conservation and ethical reasons, but also to be able to provide a stable and flat substrate to gild over, because when you apply gold leaf, it will take on the texture of whatever it's applied to.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for filling us in on that information. And I think when you had got all these layers of paint off, you were even able to see some of the marks of the original stonemasons that had actually worked on that, which is very exciting, I think, as well. So now it's time to introduce our third guest, who's been sitting very patiently beside you, Alex, Lukas Konacki, who is the senior gilder on this project. So good evening, Lukas.
Good evening, David. Good evening, everyone.
And I understand that you grew up next to a palace, or rather to a museum in a palace, which inspired you to study the history of art. And I understand that led to a fine arts degree, and later you try to find a more practical application of this knowledge in conservation. And if I've got this correct, your introduction to the techniques and art of gilding happened while you were working on a major project at a monastery in your native Poland. And I think since then, it's fair to say you've never looked back. So to begin, can you just explain what gilding is and the difference between water gilding and oil gilding?
Yes, so gilding is very old technique. We have example gilding already from ancient Egypt. Gilding basically is the technique for applying gold leaf for prepared surface, and we have two main techniques. First one is water gilding. It's mostly for interior, and it's gilding for timber. So for example, it's like picture frames, like old picture frames of furniture. And another technique is oil gilding. Oil gilding is for interior, but also for exterior, and it's gilding for decorative surfaces, for example, like stone or metal. So that's the technique we use for Queen Elizabeth Tower.
That's great. Before you take us in detail through the gilding work done on the stone, on the clock dials, and on the roof, please can you tell us about the essential material used by a gilder, gold leaf?
So for this project, we use real gold to loose leaf. Is the best we use for this project. We use the best quality of the gold, and the gold is very interesting material. It's extremely thin and very light. We can see on the picture. It's very delicate, but at the same time, after apply on the surface, the gilding is extremely durable. So our gilding will be like for generations.
Yeah, now you applied this gilding to different surfaces, stone and metal, and you'll be explaining that as we go along. But let's start with the photographs of the application of a beautiful checkered design to a stone surface.
Yeah, so here we have again Ellie Daniel, very good conservator. So basically, after all this hard work and time-consuming paint stripping, we have here pilasters, and these pilasters, they look like clean canvas. So we had to everything very properly remeasure, stenciling all these checkers, and then apply 2 coats of special primer designed for this project. So Ellie has done beautiful job. She was very neat and very precise in this job.
It looks wonderful, and when you look up now, you can see these pilasters on the side of the clock, can't you? On either side
Yes.
of them. And in an earlier event in this series of Meet the Contractors, we heard from the stonemasons, DBR, and they were telling us that they had to sometimes replace some of the damaged stone that they found on the tower. And in the next photograph, we can see how the gilding has been applied to 2 different stone surfaces, one original and one newly replaced.
Yes, that is very interesting, because we apply in like above we have original Victorian stone with big texture, and below we have replacement with smooth surface. So we have example of the 2 different effects of gilding. It was the gilding on the original stone was sometimes quite difficult because of the big texture, but gives actually very nice finish.
It is a beautiful photograph, isn't it? And as you say, very interesting to see the 2 different effects of the gilding on different surfaces. Now, Alex was telling us earlier that the quality of the gilding depends on the preparation of the stone and the application of the base layers. So what I'd like you to do, Lucas, is take us through step by step a series of images that we have of a Welsh dragon. Just to say that at the corners of the clock faces, there are heraldic beasts. And the one we're going to focus on is a Welsh dragon, which is at one corner of the stone surround. And if you could just take us through what we're looking at now, which I believe is before the restoration began.
Yes, that's right. That's the Welsh dragon from clock face, probably from the north side. So the clock face was covered with so many layers of the paint. And you can see condition was very poor. All the paint was flaking, gold was duller. So basically we had to paint strip everything, all these layers. It was very hard work.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because we can see, as you were saying earlier, you said gold leaf is a very durable surface. And I'm sure that we can see that the gold is still there on the gilding, even after all these years, since the 1980s. But that you wouldn't know unless you removed it what the condition was underneath. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. It was like that. So that's why we have to remove all the layers of the paint of the gilding to go to original stone. So we have proper base for gilding. Yeah, we have the Welsh dragon of the paint strippings. So we can see a lot of more details. Is the dragon is more sharp. We actually, after paint stripping, we discover chisel marks after stonemason chisel marks, and also around we can expose natural color of the stone.
Yeah, that's a beautiful image of the stone. So can you just now take us step by step through the stages? Now you've got the clean stone, how you actually apply the different parts of the gilding process.
So after this work, in next photograph, we apply 2 coats of primer on the dragon and on surrounding decoration.
Yep, and let's look at the next stage.
And in the next stage, we apply special top coat, 2 top coats, to make the surface smooth and glossy. And also, after this process, we have to apply oil size. So after that, we had a special window when we can apply gold leaf. And here, Xavier, very good woodcarver and very fast gilder, he applying gold leaf on the Welsh dragon.
Okay, so Sorry to interrupt you, Lucas, but I just wanted to summarise where we've been. So the stone is cleaned, and then you apply the primer, and then the top coat, and then you put on the oil size, which creates a tacky surface on which you can then place the gold leaf. And as you can say, we can see that happening here. I think this is a very interesting picture, actually, because we now realise how big that dragon is, because obviously from the ground it looks very, very small. So we've now got something really special, and this is some pictures, Alex, that you took, time-lapse pictures of this. I think they're called skewings, aren't they? The little extra pieces of gold that are left as you apply the sheets of gold with a special brush. So let's just watch this.
You can see as the skewings are removed, the luster of the gold really shines through. At 20 seconds was actually 8 minutes of filming. It was, it's amazing actually how long it takes to remove all of the skewings successfully.
But I think that's the closest that any of us will ever feel, to being part of this gilding process. It's like we're standing just behind that gentleman's shoulder and watching him work. So let's now look at the finished version of the completed dragon. And thank you so much to both of you for taking us through that process, because this is beautiful, isn't it? We can see the cobalt blue paint, which has been added behind the gilded dragon to make it stand out. And just a beautiful image of something which has now been restored to the way it should have been in the first place. So
this is why we needed to make sure we didn't damage the underlying stone. You can see how much of the substrate the gold leaf shows up.
Indeed. Thank you very much. So, Lucas, let's now move on from the gilding of the surrounding stone to the gilding of the clock faces. And your work began after the new pot opal glass had been installed into the cast iron frame. So if you could just talk us through the next two images, please.
Yeah, so here is Gavin Smith, very good gilder and another supervisor. He applying gold leaf on fretwork. So he basically, for gilding, we use special brush, what we call a tip. And each time he had to, with this tip, he have to touch his forehead or the cheek, pick up like oil or grease from his skin. And then he used this tip to pick up the gold leaf from the book and then apply for the surface. And here we have all full coverage. We have it's covered with the gold, but we have all the skewings. Skewings is like overlaps. So after that, we have to, with another brush, what we call mop, we have to like buffing up, remove all the skewings, and all the skewings we always trying to collect to avoid any wastage and reuse them.
We now have a photograph taken when the job on the clock face was complete and before the hands were installed. And I think, again, another beautiful image, which shows the new hand-blown white pot opal glass and the impressive gilding. How long, Lucas, did it take to gild all 4 clock faces, north, south, east and west?
It was like about 2 years. It was like two years. It was massive work.
Okay, that's great. So we'll come back to the gilding in a moment, but I'd just like to turn back to Alex now and to talk about a row of shields above the clock face. Now, can you just tell us about those shields? Because when we saw the earlier photograph of the clock face before conservation, they were black and gold, but now they've been painted red and white, like the cross of St. George. Why the change in colour?
Well, there was a conspicuous lack of material evidence from the sampling. Shields had potentially undergone some kind of paint stripping, or at any rate, other than the black and gold scheme, there was no other scheme present. But it was quite clear that the black and gold wasn't part of Charles Barry's original scheme. So we relied on archival evidence in the form of watercolour by Charles Barry of the scheme that we were reinstating. And this clearly shows the St. George's crosses painted on the shields. So the decision was made to reinstate the St. George's crosses.
Okay, so another part of the detective work that you had to carry out in order to restore the original scheme. And accessing that part of the tower to paint the shields and complete the gilding wasn't easy. Can you just tell us about that, Alex?
Oh, this image illustrates perfectly the often tight and awkward spaces that our team had to work in. On this particular gangway, you couldn't politely past one another. It was so narrow. I mean, it wasn't all quite this tight, but this is an example, probably the most extreme. You certainly couldn't stand back and admire your work.
Right, yeah, and I think we have a very unusual photograph now that contrasts the two clock faces before and after. And can you tell us why this photograph is so special?
Yeah, this image, I think, well, it captures a site that I think never be seen again. It's the 21st century restoration of Elizabeth Tower's historic scheme, abutted against its iconic 20th century incarnation. And this image here is the north clock face once it was revealed. It's the first time that we're able to stand back and admire our work.
Lucas, in a moment I'd like you to talk about the gilding on the roof, but first of all, just a word about the three parts of the roof. In this graphic we can see the lower part is called roof A, and the very top is called roof C, but the part that we want to focus on is the part in between, which is called roof B, and that's where most of the gilding is. So can you tell us, Lucas, about the gilding of roof B? And as I mentioned in my introduction, the roof and its decorations are all made of cast iron.
Yes, so here we have example of details from the roof B. As you say, that is the most gilded part of the roof. We started from this part because this part was just ready for us. We were preparing the metalwork for gilding, so we can see applying 2 top coats, and then we apply the old size for gilding.
And then once the size was applied, you could then apply the gold leaf.
And then we apply the gold leaf, and actually here is my hand buffing up the gilding, so we can see all how the metal is shining, how the gilding can make, how it's changing, how the surface is very shiny.
And another part of the decoration was the shields with this foliage in between. Can you just say a word about what we're seeing here?
Oh, so that is like above these details, what we saw. That's the shields and leaves, like on the top of the, like above this decoration, this top part of the roof B. And here is Janet Carey, our gilder and very good sunwriter. So here she preparing surface for gilding, and Janet just painting the borders around the shields. And it was very difficult because she didn't have the line to follow, and she has done amazing job on the roof, amazing job.
So let's just have a look at some of the finished work that was just below roof A, and we can see here too the gilded borders of the shields and the golden foliage between them, and in the distance above the shields and foliage of roof B. And next we go to an amazing image of the completed gilding on roof B. And I believe you took this photograph, Lucas. So can you just tell us about it?
Oh, yes, I did this picture. That is all gilded, all the roof B and roof above gilded. It was amazing picture. You can see the reflection. We realized how beautiful is that when the scaffold came down, because we working in like awkward, we don't have distance to look back, and everyone how we proud to be part of this project and how lucky we are to be part of the history.
Now, Lucas, you've taken us in great detail through the gilding of these different parts of the tower. And can you just tell us what was the most surprising aspect of your work on the tower?
For me, the most surprising was variety of the details, because we have so different shapes. I was just overwhelmed about the variety of the different shapes what we gilded.
And what for you was the most challenging part of this project?
The most challenging, it was working in different environments, because sometimes it was very cold, sometimes it was extremely hot, and also we were working very often in confined spaces. It was so difficult. Sometimes, and also we had a wind, sometimes it was like wind tunnel. It was really, sometimes was very, very difficult and very challenging, but I think all team have done a great job.
And that's really interesting, isn't it, Alex? Because in terms of managing the project, I believe there are only certain times of the year when you can be carrying out gilding.
Ideally, gilding especially is very sensitive to drops in temperature. This image here shows some of the roof elements that we gilded at ground level. The contractor Shepleys, who were working on the roof, were reinstalling the roof throughout the year, and so obviously some parts of it were programmed over the winter. The parts that were going to be installed over the winter were problematic because there's only one chance to do this gilding. We don't have a second chance. So we need to make sure that we gild in the optimum conditions. So these elements that were scheduled to be installed in the winter were brought to site early. We gilded them ahead of time. These were brought to site in the summer. And then they were installed when in the winter. But I'd just like to say that it did make Shepley's job a lot harder, because not only were they handling a heavy cast iron lump, they were also having to be careful with the delicate and very expensive gold. But it was necessary to keep the project going, to keep the program.
Yeah, and if we finally now go to the very top of the roof, top of roof A, and we begin with a photo of the newly gilded crown that's there. Now, Lucas, I understand you were surprised by the size of the decoration at the top when you saw it close up for the first time.
Oh yes, that's right. I was very surprised because from the ground, that's his picture of the spire. So from the ground, the spire looks very small and very delicate, like pinhead. But actually on the scaffold, I realized it's so big, the height of the spire is like free floor of the building. And so there was a lot of surface for gilding there.
Indeed, and if we go further up, we can see a cascade of downward facing flowers with leaves above, all of which have been beautifully regilded. And right at the very top, the orb with the cross, which I believe represents God above the world. Now, Lucas, I believe that gilding the orb was very challenging. Can you just explain why?
Yeah, it was very challenging and difficult because it's kind of like open work. So we had to gild in the stages. So it was gilding from inside to outside. Janet and Ellie, they have done an amazing job on this orb on the cross.
And that's yet another amazing image that you've been able to share with our audience this evening. So thank you for all of those fantastic photographs. And in a moment, we're going to take questions from the audience. But before we do, I would like to just finish with this image of the tower, so we can see how it looks right now. Now, this is just a snap that I took on my way into work. And we can see that as the scaffolding comes down, the newly restored roof and the clock faces are emerging. And actually, now, of course, we're all very informed about roof B, and we can look out for the beautiful gilding that's up there. So I'm now going to move to questions from the audience. And let me just have a quick look, see what questions we've got. How is the gold leaf made, and where is it made? Asked Sharon. Lucas, is that a question, or Alex, you could answer?
So the first part was, how is gold leaf made? Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
It's hand beaten. Actually, it's still produced the same way it's historically been produced, hand beaten to very, very thin sheets, and it's just continuously beaten until it's. I mean, I have got written down somewhere how thin it is. It's very thin, and it's produced in Italy.
Okay, in Italy. Thank you very much. And how much gold did you use, just roughly, to do the gilding on the tower?
Quantity of gold leaf. I think it was something in the region of 181,000 leads.
Okay, so really quite a lot. Well, we've seen how much gilding you actually had to do there. Anonymous says, very impressed with all the skilled work. Thank you for sharing. What were working conditions like being so high up? I think you've answered that question already, Lucas. And do you get used to it if you're there every day? I think we're interested to hear your answer to that one. Do you get used to the freezing cold and the hot temperatures and the gales that blow up there?
Oh yeah, we kind of get used to it, and in the beginning, gilding in this different environment was quite difficult. But actually, after a while, we get in better and better. So actually, we get used to it, and yeah, and it was, and we managed to work in this environment.
I know because of our technical problems, we're a little short of time now, so I do apologise to those people who asked questions that we won't get to, but let me just try this one. Now that the layers of paint and gilding applied over the years have been removed, will the original stone deteriorate faster because there are less layers over the top protecting the carving?
That is an interesting question, and now the stone doesn't have its protective cocoon of paint on it anymore, so there is definitely potential for weathering of the exposed areas, but in my opinion, the areas that are not worth saving, that's not what I mean, but the intricate carvings in the spandrels of the clock faces are actually protected with gold. So really the only areas left exposed are flat stonework. And I'm not saying that that's any less valuable, but it would be easier to replace or restore if that needs to happen.
That's really interesting, because there was another question that was saying, how do you protect the gold? But it's actually the gold that's protecting the stone, isn't it? So I think that's how it works.
Yeah, gold, if left alone, will last as long as the glue holding it down to keeping it fixed down. It doesn't tarnish, but it is very delicate, so it doesn't respond very well to being handled. But yeah, gold will last forever in theory.
Indeed, much longer than paint. But listen, I'm very sorry to say this, because I know there's more questions and we've got so much information that you could share with us, but I think the gremlins have got to us a little this evening and we've come to the end of our time. So thank you very much to everyone who's attended and asked all those questions. A reminder that the next talk on the construction and conservation of the Elizabeth Tower is on the 18th of November. And don't forget to tell us what you thought on the survey. Now, remember, you'll get your 15% discount to use in the online shop. And if you want to keep up to date with news on the tower, including its reopening, then do sign up for our newsletter. Details on that will be up in a moment. So thank you to all three of you, to Lewis, to Lucas, and to Alex, for being our guest this evening. Thank you to everyone who came along to this event. And finally, to the backstage team, Isabel, Tom and Sam, who I'm sure we kept on their point all evening with all our technical challenges, but they did manage to get us safely to the end. And so all it remains to me, for me to say is thank you, everybody, and good night.